In Norway, Martin and his friends stumble upon a hidden treasure inside a mountain cabin. Unknowingly, this awakens a horde of Nazi zombies led by Colonel Herzog, who are determined to reclaim their lost gold. The undead mercilessly hunt down the group, killing them one by one. Martin, the sole survivor, severs his own arm to prevent infection from a zombie bite. In a desperate attempt to escape, he returns the treasure and rushes to his car. However, just as he thinks he's safe, he realizes a coin is still in his pocket, triggering Herzog's return. As Martin starts his car, Herzog smashes through the window and grabs him. More zombies leap onto the vehicle, but Martin manages to fight back, kicking off a soldier and headbutting Herzog. Speeding away, Martin drags a zombie whose intestines get caught on broken glass, pulling them out gruesomely. On the road, Herzog continues attacking until a passing truck collides with him, tearing off his arm and seemingly ending the nightmare. Relieved, Martin tosses the coin out in celebration. Meanwhile, the truck driver checks on Herzog's body and attempts CPR, only to have his tongue bitten off before the zombies swarm him. Herzog retrieves the coin and orders his men to hide the treasure. Noticing a Talvik fish logo on the truck, Herzog recalls a long-forgotten mission. Exhausted, Martin drives through the night but struggles to stay awake. He tunes into the radio for distraction, but instead finds a dull documentary, causing him to doze off. His car veers off the road, crashing down a hill. When he regains consciousness, he's handcuffed to a hospital bed, surrounded by police who blame him for his friends' deaths, refusing to believe his zombie story. The doctor informs him that his severed arm was found and reattached, but to Martin's horror, it isn't his arm. It's Herzog's. The undead limb has a will of its own, breaking the handcuff, shoving a cop aside, and seizing a scalpel to kill the doctor. Another officer intervenes, but the possessed arm hurls him across the room. Martin, terrified and apologizing, insists he isn't in control. Security restrains him while a nurse sedates him. Meanwhile, in a nearby house, Herzog brutally murders a man after beheading his wife. A zombie doctor then retrieves Martin's severed arm and reattaches it to Herzog's stump using their undead powers. That night, Herzog leads his army to a cemetery, attempting to resurrect fallen soldiers. When the corpses fail to rise due to their decayed state, he turns his attention to fresh victims, starting with a terrified priest, whom he kills and reanimates as his new recruit. At the hospital, Martin has a vision of zombies attacking the city. When he wakes up, he finds himself still restrained. A young American tourist named Bobby sneaks into his room, fascinated by his zombie-like arm. Bobby, a member of the Zombie Squad, a group preparing for the inevitable zombie apocalypse, photographs Martin's arm and sends it to his team. Martin warns him about the real zombie threat, but before he can explain, Bobby releases his restraints. Suddenly, Martin's rogue arm flings the boy out the window. Horrified, Martin rushes outside to help but accidentally crushes Bobby's chest while attempting CPR. A police officer catches him in the act and assumes the worst. Panicking, Martin flees, but the zombie arm takes control, using a car emblem as a deadly projectile to kill the cop. Another officer gives chase, forcing Martin to break into a car and speed away. As he drives, Bobby's phone rings. The caller is Daniel, leader of the Zombie Squad, who was expecting to hear from Bobby. Martin explains the situation, warning of Herzog's army. Daniel and his team, Monica and Blake, decide to travel to Norway despite their doubts. Meanwhile, Police Chief Gunga learns of Martin's escape and, despite a lack of resources, prepares his officers for a manhunt. Upon arriving in Norway, the Zombie Squad gears up with makeshift weapons from a hardware store. At the same time, Martin visits a World War II museum to learn more about Herzog. There he discovers that Herzog was once one of Hitler's closest allies, tasked with wiping out the Norwegian town of Talvik in retaliation for an attack on a German warship. However, before Herzog's army could carry out the mission, the locals killed them. Realizing that Herzog's undead forces are now attempting to complete this unfinished task, Martin searches a map for Talvik, only to witness zombies already attacking tourists outside the museum. The undead refill a tank's fuel using a victim's intestines before Herzog transforms the slain tourists into new soldiers. Martin and the museum receptionist, Glenn, barely evade detection by pretending to be statues. When the coast is clear, Martin realizes his new arm possesses Herzog's power, capable of raising the dead under his control. Testing this, he accidentally revives a corpse, proving he can create his own undead army. The zombie squad arrives just in time to witness this, and Daniel, excited by the discovery, proposes using Martin's ability to raise Soviet soldiers who had been killed by Herzog during the war. They set off to find the mass graves while Glenn, Monica, and Blake attempt to slow down Herzog's army. Meanwhile, the zombies, now in possession of the museum's tank, continue their rampage. They slaughter civilians in horrific ways, impaling victims, strangling them with intestines, and even gunning down mothers with their babies. By the time the police arrive at the museum, all that remains are lifeless bodies. Surveillance footage of Martin grabbing Glenn leads Gunga to believe Martin is behind the massacre. To delay Herzog's march, Glenn lures part of the zombie army into a swamp, where Monica and Blake strategically detonate bombs, killing half of them. Enraged, Herzog orders his troops to retaliate. Amidst the chaos, Martin and Daniel reach the burial site of the Soviet soldiers. With a surge of power, Martin's arm sends an energy wave into the ground, resurrecting the fallen Russians, who recognize him as their new leader. The next morning, Herzog's army reaches Talvik, but Martin and his newly formed Russian zombie army are waiting. A brutal battle erupts. Though the Russians fight fiercely, they are outnumbered. Herzog's forces begin overpowering them. Meanwhile, Gunga and his officers arrive but are crushed by the Nazi tank. In the thick of the battle, Herzog and Soviet Lieutenant Stavarin finally face off. Stavarin initially gains the upper hand, but is ultimately overpowered when Herzog's soldiers interfere. As the fight rages on, Martin and Herzog crash through a house, battling viciously. Despite Martin's efforts, Herzog proves too strong, slamming him into walls and burning his face on a stove. Outside, Glenn and the women fight valiantly, but the zombies keep coming. Just as Glenn is about to confess something important, he's killed mid-sentence. Inside the tank, Daniel fights off two zombie drivers. Though he holds his own, he is eventually overpowered and stabbed. Meanwhile, Herzog is on the verge of killing Martin, until Daniel, in a last-ditch effort, crashes the tank into the house, scooping both men up. The zombie assistant kills the priest, but is promptly run over. In a final moment of desperation, Daniel activates the tank's cannon, blowing Herzog's head off. Without their leader, the remaining zombies collapse lifelessly. With the battle over, the zombie squad bids farewell to Martin. As Gunga and his officers are left to deal with the aftermath, Martin visits his deceased girlfriend's grave. Using his newfound power, he revives her, and the two share an intimate moment in his car, unaware that the Nazi doctor has recovered Herzog's severed head, which suddenly opens its eyes.